Hey there, my name is Uma. In this video, we'll be building a functional URL shortener application using React, Firebase, Python, and Heroku. Let's get started. Before we begin, let's take a look at the application we will be building. My version of the application is called Mini Linkit, but you can name yours whatever you want. It is a single-page application that has two input fields and a button. The first field is where the user enters the long URL they want to shorten, say, for example, this. The second field is a field where the user can input an optional alias. If it's left blank, the application generates one for the user, and if the user inputs one, then the application uses the one that the user inputs, provided it has not been used before. When the user is done, they click the Mini Linkit button and it generates a mini link for them. They can then use this button to copy the link to the clipboard, and if they paste it on here, it redirects them to the original long URL link. This is a beginner to intermediate project, but more on the intermediate side because it requires you to have some basic knowledge of React and Python. We won't be doing anything too fancy, and I'll break down each step of the process so everyone, regardless of skill level, can follow along. The code for the project is also on my GitHub page, in case you're following along and need clarity on any step. If you're also looking to add a project to your portfolio, this is a really good one to add. It's simple, functional, and short, so anyone who actually goes to your portfolio can interact with what you've built. Okay, let's get started. Before we write any code, we have to understand the overall architecture of the system. The system is going to have three main components. The first is the client, which is the React app. This is the single-page application where the user inputs their long URL. The application then generates a short URL for them. The next component is the database, where the generated URL and the original long URL are stored. The final component is the server that listens to calls made with the generated URL. When the server is called using the generated URL, it goes to the server, fetches the long URL, and redirects the page to the long URL's address. The client will be in React. We'll be using Firebase database to store the long and generated URL, and the server would be a Python Flask application. Let's start writing the code. I'll speed up processes that take time using some editing magic, but I won't skip over any steps. A prerequisite to following along is you need to have Node.js and Python installed on your computer. If you don't have them installed, you can install them using Homebrew on the Mac, or you can download them from their website. Create a project folder and open it using your favorite text editor. I'm using VS Code because I like it, but you could use whatever text editor you want. The folder should be empty and look like this. The next thing we'll do is create the React app. Open a terminal and navigate to the folder you created, or use the inbuilt terminal on VS Code. Run npx create app followed by your app name. For my case is URL shortener demo client. You can give your app whatever name you want. This should take about 45 seconds. Next thing we'll do is cd into the client app we've just created and install all the packages we'll need. So we'll do cd URL shortener client, enter. Then we'll install all the packages we need. Run npm install all the packages on the screen. While the packages install, I'll explain what each package does. Bootstrap is basically pre-written CSS, so we don't have to worry about the styling of the page too much. React Bootstrap is basically Bootstrap but for React. Nanoid generates the unique identifier that will append to the generated URL. React Router DOM handles routing for the pages of the application. Firebase is where we'll store the data for the application. Valid URL tells us if a given URL is valid or not. We'll use this to verify URLs when a user inputs the URL. So they don't just input jargons and we just save useless URLs that can't do anything. Now that those are done installing, now would be a great time to set up our Firebase application. Open a browser and navigate to console.firebase.google.com or the URL on the screen. Click Add Project, give your project a name. I'll name mine URL shortener demo video, but you can name yours whatever you want. Enable Google Analytics for the project and click Continue. Select the default account, click Create Project. This should take about 10 seconds. When it's done, click Continue. Click on the web here, give your app a name, register the app, copy this information here. We will need it for a later step. You can always come back to it as well. Click Continue to Console, click Real-Time Database, then click Create Database, leave the default, click Next, click Start in Test Mode, and click Enable. This creates our project database where we'll store the generated URLs and the long URL. Now the database is ready, we'll head back to the code. Our packages are also installed. First place we want to go to is index.js in the source folder. The first thing we'll do is import browser router like this. And we'll wrap the app in browser router like this. We will then import initialize Firebase so we can connect our app to Firebase like this. We'll also copy and paste the config we got from Firebase like this. We will then call initialize app right underneath DOM.render like this. All we've done here is we've configured our app to talk to Firebase when the app starts running. And that's it. We're done with the index page. The next page we want to go to is the app.js page, which is right here. We'll clear all the imports from the top and add our own imports. The first import we want to add is related to React Router DOM. We're basically importing browser router, router switch from React Router DOM. All of these would help with routing for the application. Next, we're going to import the Bootstrap module. This basically helps with Bootstrap. Then app.css, which is the CSS for our application. And finally, we're going to import the form page. This hasn't been created yet, but we're going to create it for last. Next thing we'll do is clear everything in the return div for the function app like this. We'll then create a div and give it a name of class like this. Enter. We'll create another div and give it a class name of auth wrapper like this. We'll create a final div and give it a name of auth inner like this. We'll open a switch tag and close the switch tag like this. And in the switch tag, we'll add two routes, which will basically route to the form page that we're going to create. The first route looks like this, which directs any path with / to our component form. And the next path looks like this, which says if it's / app, redirect it to the component form as well. As I mentioned earlier, the page is a single page application that will have only one page. And regardless of where the user goes, whether it's just / or our URL / app, it'll redirect them to our form. I'm going to hold Shift Option F to align and format the page nicely. That's it for the app.js page. The next page we'll be changing is the index.css page. I'm not going to go into the CSS because CSS is a whole different ballgame by itself, but I'm going to copy and paste some CSS that is available on my GitHub if you're following along. Just copy the index.css on my GitHub page and paste it in your index.css. When you're done, it should look like this. We're almost done with the React app. We have one more page, which is the main form page, which is this page where the user inputs their URL and we basically generate the short URL and give it back to them. For that, we're going to create a folder called components in the source folder. In components, we're going to create a file named form.js. In form.js, we're going to start with our imports. The first thing we're going to import is React because every React component or every React page needs to import React or React component. Next thing we're going to import is Nanoid, which, as I mentioned earlier, is going to help us generate these IDs here. So that, first of all, we need them to be URL safe, so they can't have spaces or special characters. And Nanoid is basically going to help us generate those ones. The next thing we'll be importing would be the Firebase database methods that we're going to use. Next would be its web URI, which would basically tell us if the URL that the user has entered is a valid URL or not. Then we're going to import overlay trigger, which is a React Bootstrap component that will help us with the tooltip. And finally, we're going to import the tooltip itself from React Bootstrap. The tooltip is this thing right here that shows copied when you've clicked copied, and if you haven't clicked copied, it'll show copy to clipboard. That's basically what those components will help us do. Next thing we'll do is create the component class itself like this. The next thing we'll do is initialize the state of the application in the constructor like this. Long URL will store the long URL that the user inputs. Preferred alias would store whatever the user inputs here as their preferred alias for their URL. Generated URL would be the URL that we generate for the user, either using what we generate or what the user inputs. It'll end up being this field right here. Loading would basically show a spinner button if it's true. So say we're doing an asynchronous task. One of them would be to write to the database and confirm that everything is good. Then we send the confirmed URL back to the user. In situations like that, we don't just want to keep the user waiting. We want to show that it's loading, and we're going to use this Boolean. Errors will be used to keep track of which fields on our form have errors, and error messages would be used to keep track of the corresponding errors for error. And then the tooltip message would be copy to clipboard initially, but when the user then clicks copy to the clipboard, then we're gonna change it to copied in a later method. Next method we'll write would be the submit method, which would be the method that's called when the user clicks submit. When the user clicks this button here, this will be the method that will be called. First thing we'll do is call this method here, which basically prevents the page from reloading when the user clicks submit. Next, we'll set loading to true, which will indicate that, hey, the user has clicked submit and we're about to start something that is synchronous. So the button is going to change to a spinner, and we're going to set generated URL to blank so we don't use an old URL. Next thing we'll do is validate the input. So validate the data that the user has given us. We're going to do that by calling an asynchronous method we'll write in the future called validate input, and it's going to return a boolean. It's going to either return true or false. Now, if the form is not valid, we just return, and by this method is also going to generate errors if there are any errors in the form. If there's no errors, then it won't go in here because this would be false, and not false is true. Sorry, this would be true, which means the form is valid, and not true is false, so it won't go in here. The next thing we do is generate the alias that we're going to use. To do that, we basically call nanoid method and call 5. 5 here means we want 5 characters. You can use 6 characters or 7 characters. I'm using 5 because we want it to be in a short form like this. With 5, the combinations are in billions as well because it uses numbers, special characters, uppercase letters, and lowercase letters as well. So that's more than enough. But if you want to add more characters to yours, go ahead. We'll then append our URL. For me, it's minilink.com. This will change when we're deploying it because the URL that Heroku will give us will be different, but we're going to change that when that time comes. And we'll append the generated key to the URL, so it'll look something like this, our generated key plus the URL. Next thing we'll do is check if the user has input a preferred alias. So if the user has entered an alias here that they want, then we're going to have to go with their alias, right? So we're going to make our generated key, which we initialized up here, to whatever alias that the user has said they preferred. And we're going to change our generated URL as well to whatever alias that the user has preferred plus our original link. So these two variables will change if the user has input their preferred alias. Finally, we write the contents of the generated URL and the original long URL to the database. We simply do that by creating a reference to the Firebase database here. Then we call the set method, passing in our reference to the database and the path that we wanted to write using our generated key, which is a unique key here or a unique key that the user gives us as the key. Then we write in all this data to the database, and when we're done, so when everything passes, we set state for the generated URL to be the generated URL we created, and then we set loading to false so that we can tell the user that, hey, everything is good. That's what happens when the user submits the form. We do need to handle error here. Next thing we'll write would be our helper functions. The first helper function is a has error function that basically returns true or false if the key for one of the input fields is in our errors array. So if the key for one of the input fields is in our errors array, then it means that field has an error, and we can use this as a boolean to return true or false. So we can show red if there's an error, or we can just leave it, right? If it's false, then there's no error. The next helper method is a handle change method that's called each time a user types something into the field. So when you type something into the input field, this method is called. It passes in an event which basically takes in the ID of the field and the value that you've typed in, which as the target. We then set the state using the ID and the value. In this case, the ID would be long URL. It'll set long URL to whatever we're typing to long URL, and it'll set preferred alias to whatever we're typing to preferred alias. The next method we need to write is the validate input method. This is the method that goes through the form and makes sure that everything in our form looks good. First things we do is initialize our error. So at the beginning, there's no error, and whatever error messages we have are what was there before, so we don't clear it from the system. We then validate the long URL. So these lines of code validate the long URL. If the user hasn't input any URL at all, meaning the length of the URL is 0, there's 0 characters, then we push, hey, there's an error with long URL, and we push the error message of please enter a URL. Or if what they've entered is not a web URI, so if it's not a proper URL, Then we push, hey, please enter the proper URL. That's all the validation we need for the long URL. We just need to make sure there's something there and it's a URL. You can add your own validation. I'm pretty sure you can make sure that whatever URL that the user is putting is shorter than the short URL you've created. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense. But that's just the way I'm doing mine. You can do yours whatever way you want and add whatever restrictions you want. The next restrictions are for the preferred alias. This would only happen if a user has input a preferred alias. So if the preferred alias they've put in is not blank, then we want to check that the alias they've put in is less than 7 characters. If it's more than 7 characters, then at that point in time, it doesn't make sense to be making a long URL. Or you can do yours however you want. I'm limiting mine to 7 characters for a preferred URL. If that's the case, then we tell them, hey, put in less characters. Otherwise, the second thing is we check to make sure there's no spaces in the URL. So we can't have space in whatever alias that they've put in. So they can't put in 7 something space something something, right? This is minilink.com/this is not a valid URL. So we can't put that in. That's why I'm checking for space there. Finally, we call this method. We want to check if whatever preferred URL that they've put in already exists in our database. And that's basically what this method does. So it's an asynchronous call that goes to the database and checks if that thing exists. We're going to write this method soon. So if the key exists, then we push, hey, the alias you've entered already exists. Please select another one. When that's done, we update the state of the page, updating errors, error messages, and we set loading to false, meaning we're done doing whatever asynchronous work we have. If there are errors, so if the length of errors is 0, meaning we found an error here, here, or here and pushed something, then we want to return false. And if that's not the case, then we basically return true. Now, remember this method here, validate input, will be called by this method up here. So this is where we'll call the method, and if the form is valid, everything goes through. If it's not valid, then we simply return and show those errors from the error messages. The next method is the method that checks if a key exists in the database. We basically get a reference to the database and just try to fetch a record in the database with whatever alias that the user has said they want to use as the alias, right? So if it exists, then we just return that. If there's an error, we return false. If it exists, we basically just return that, and this method here checks if that key exists. So we call this would return a promise, and then when we resolve the promise, we'll check if the key exists. If it exists, then it means that record exists. If it doesn't exist, then all good. The next method is the copy to clipboard method, which basically copies whatever the generated URL we've created is to the clipboard. We set the tooltip message state to copied. So when you click copy, it'll change to copied. But before it was click to copy to clipboard, and after we click copy, then we want to change that message to copied. And that's this tooltip message right here. The final method will be the render method, which has all our HTML code. So the first thing we're going to want to do is create a container, a div with container. And in our div, we're going to want to put a form in our div, like this. Inside the form, we're going to put the header for our application. For me, it's mini link it. For you, it could be whatever name you want to give your application. This text here is what appears up here. The next thing we do is we start adding the input fields. The first input field is this one, where we have the label that says enter your URL, followed by our input field. We give it an ID of long URL. If anything changes, we call this.unchanged, meaning the user is inputting something. The state, so the value for the URL is this.state.url, this type of URL. It's required. And the class name for it, if our error array has long URL in it, then show that there's an error. So show that the form is not valid. Otherwise, just show that the form is valid and everything is fine. And the placeholder for it is https www/. That's this one right here. If I open this on a new page, that's basically what you see right here. That's that input field. The next field is the error message field. So this will only show if error has long URL in it. So if our error field has long URL, it'll show up as danger. Otherwise, it'll show up as is visually hidden. So if I click this, then now you see it because there's an error here. Otherwise, it doesn't show up at all. The next field is very similar to the previous one, which is this field right here, except it has this URL attached to it, which is what we have right here. This is the label. Same thing like previous. If there's error, then it shows up as errored. Otherwise, there's no error. And the error message, same thing here. If there's error in suggested alias or preferred alias, sorry, this should be preferred alias, then we put the text as danger. Otherwise, we don't show anything. This is the placeholder, which is what we have right here. Can you guess what's next? You're right. It's the button. So the button is very similar to the previous ones, just a button class. When we click the button, we call our onSubmit method, which is this method that we worked on. If it's loading, then we want to show a spinner. But if it's not loading, this is a conditional statement in React. So if the state of the page is loading, show a spinner button. Otherwise, show a button that says mini link it, but make the spinner class visually hidden. The final part of the form page is this part right here that shows after you've created a URL. It has, if there's no generated URL on the page, then we don't show anything. We show an empty div. Otherwise, if there's a generated URL, we show, the URL generated is an input field that is disabled, so the user can't do anything on there. It has disabled right there. There's an overlay trigger, which all of this does is just helps with the tooltip. So when I hover, you can see it here, and this is the button here where when we click it, we copy to clipboard, which is this copy to clipboard method that we made right here. And that's pretty much it. The final thing we have to do is export the form. We save a page. Next thing we do is run npm start, and it should start up the server. We're getting an error. So the error we're getting here is we imported a router, but router is not getting used. I made a mistake. We're supposed to wrap the entire app class in router like this. And now we are using the router. Obviously we imported it, so we should be using it. It says our application is running here on localhost. So let's copy this, go to localhost, and yes, it works. Yes. Our application is running. Everything seems to be working, no errors. We're gonna test and see if we can shorten the URL. So let's input a long URL, https://www. Let's do google.com, and let's click mini link it. Okay, we have created a link. We can then go to our database and check if that has been created. Yes, that has been created. So we have connection from the client app to the database, which is really good. This won't work now because we haven't created the server part, but that's the next part that we're going to do. If you're following along, go grab some water. We're halfway done, almost there. We just need to create the server app and then deploy the application. Great job so far. Great job, we're doing good. Okay, video producer Uma here. While editing the video, I realized it was taking too long, and so I've decided to split the video into two parts. The part you just watched is the part where we created the React app and made sure it worked locally. The next part, we just link either here or here, I'm not sure. And down in the description is the part where we make the Flask web server and deploy it via Heroku. Thanks for watching, and go check that part out.